welcome to Global Connections on Think Tech TV. I'm Patrick Bratton. Today I'm joined by a special guest, one of our adjunct faculty here at Hawaii Pacific University, Brian Fila. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Brian Fila. How are you doing today?
Good, Patrick. It's great to be here.
Good. It's your first time on Think Tech, right?
Absolutely.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons I wanted to invite you here is that you started about a year or so ago adjunct instructing for us at Hawaii Pacific University, and one of the things that one of the reasons we brought you on board is that you've had a long career in the military, particularly in the intelligence community, teaching courses for us on intelligence, which is not always a course that you always see at college universities and so on. How did you get into intelligence and the intelligence field? I mean, a lot of James Bond movies when you were a kid, or?
Well, it's only a fraction of what James Bond lives out in the films. But I started as a four-year ROTC scholarship in the Navy. Drove ships in the Navy. I was warfare qualified for 3 years, and then had the opportunity to go into naval intelligence, and did one tour on active duty in naval intelligence here in Hawaii, and that's when my family fell in love with the islands. Mm-hmm. And then I went into the reserves and stayed in the reserves for another 27 years, and went also into the civilian community, the intelligence community, when I moved back to Washington. So I had kind of a dual career. I was a civil servant while also being a uniformed reservist, and both the civilian career and the military career were associated with intelligence.
Why pick intelligence? I mean, when you were, you're a commissioned officer in the Navy. I mean, I would imagine, as an outsider looking at the Navy, a service with a lot of traditions, the draw to be a surface warfare officer or naval aviator, the sort of action sort of careers. Sometimes intelligence, might get short shrift. It might seem a little less exciting. I mean, what drew you into intelligence rather than into some of the other specializations?
Well, I think it was my personal interests in learning, the pursuit of truth, that it was always a learning environment. So I would much rather study a subject and contemplate aspects of that subject from numerous directions, and that was a ready-made approach to life for an intelligence officer. Always looking for things of interest and trying to understand them.
So kind of a passion for inquiry, in
other
words.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what brought me, excuse me, to academia, mm-hmm. because that same ethos is existent here. Looking at difficult issues from a number of different perspectives, and trying to gain understanding that could ultimately lead to truth.
Okay, interesting. I mean, and you've also approached this from several angles. I mean, whether now in the classroom, whether as in the service, whether as a civil servant. I mean, what are some of the differences, or perhaps either geographic or organizational sort of cultural differences between, being in this community in Hawaii versus being in DC versus uniform or as a civil servant? I mean, what are some observations you would have about differences in doing this?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I enjoy working with the students so much, is to talk about those cultural differences. And there are as many cultural differences as agencies. There's really 17 organizations in the U.S. intelligence community, and all of them have their own unique characteristic. When you talk about the Department of Defense from an operations point of view, that's yet another culture, and subcultures within it, whether the aviation community or the submarine community or the infantry and the Army. All of those cultures, I want to try to explain to students so that they have a better idea of where their personalities would best fit within a myriad of opportunities in Washington. Mm-hmm. And of course, as you know, there are a number of facilities here in Hawaii that people can be assigned to, associated with the intelligence community, and clearly from an operational military point of view. So what I try to do in my classes is bring real-world experience to the academic subjects that we need to wrestle with and understand, so that they've got a leg up when they go into the policy community, or they go into the intelligence community, or into the operational forces of the military, or into business, really.
I mean, one thing you probably get a lot, as I kind of started with my James Bond joke, is with the lead-in. I mean, there tends to be a lot of misperceptions at various levels about sort of what the intelligence process or what the intelligence community does. And I find with students, they range from, perhaps too many, films of James Bond in the tuxedo with the martini, seducing beautiful women in some exotic location and driving an Aston Martin, to maybe the flip side, which is the sort of commando sort of thing that everybody is Jason Bourne with the black beret blowing stuff up behind enemy lines, and calling in the resistance service. Or perhaps they think when they're getting in a class, they'll be, breaking codes, like they were Alan Turing or something, or these types of things. I mean, what are some of the fun stereotypes that you've had to play with or break down as you get in the classroom with students?
Well, as you know, what Hollywood does is takes a kernel of truth and then stretches it out so it's interesting. So if Hollywood actually made a realistic description of the intelligence community, it would be 80% things that are normal everyday life, and for some, 20% of what you see in the movies, and for others, 1% in the movies. There are people today doing things that are dangerous in foreign countries without the protection of diplomatic immunity, working for our country, sensitive to national security interests, and their lives are at risk. That looks a little bit like what you see in the movies. There are a number of people in the community that are trying to take that information, that intelligence, make it understandable, verify it, and then provide it to policy community, including the president. And that's an arduous task as well, because as you can imagine, in the amount of information that's available, how do you call through that? How do you identify what bias you're bringing to that information? How do you work closely in the policy community without being so influenced that you unintentionally spin what you're studying in a direction that would please the people that you really care about, that you believe in what they're doing? How do you remain that academic distance from that study and speak to the facts as you know them, or what we don't know and what you think about those facts? So it's a challenge, and you've all seen the little jokes about, this is what my mother thinks I do, and this is what. It's absolutely correct. I mean, I enjoy what Hollywood does with the intelligence community. I use pieces of what Hollywood has done in my classes because they've captured an accurate, pressurized environment of what's at stake and the processes that you have to go through and the danger. And then they, unfortunately, always drift into what would be extra-legal activities, the Jason Bourne-like behaviors that are great cinema, but reinforce, unfortunately, at times, a perception that the intelligence community is something different than. You don't do anything like that without a lawyer standing right next to you. Right. And you don't even contemplate those kinds of activities without a bevy of legal experts who are arguing in the background about whether this is covered under statute or if this is a gray area and what the court precedent is for those aspects. You watch that debate. You're waiting for the answer, and sometimes the answer comes down to a policy official making a call because it's a gray area. And then you put your reputation and your life on the line to follow those orders. And there's people doing that today. And you see a little bit of that in the cinema as well.
If you don't mind me putting you on the spot, I mean, if you, is there a clip or a movie in particular that you like to use in class that you think gets at a kernel that's of interest to the students, that kind of an old standby you like to use?
There are a number of good movies out there. I seldom ever use Jason Bourne or James Bond because most often what they're doing is could be characterized by some, even the more conservative things that they do, as covert action, which is only a small portion of what the intelligence community does. But Clandestine Human Collection, Spy Games, the movie with Robert Redford and Brad Pitt, and in moments capture the danger and the patriotism and the sacrifice that people who are doing clandestine intelligence collection go through. Even overt intelligence collection. I was an attaché and a military attaché. They do overt collection. They're part of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And in hostile territories, in countries that have increased pressure on them from a environmental point of view, they're doing just as dangerous things, trying to get to the truth, trying to discover what policy officials would need to understand to make the best decision possible. And again, that conversation of, is this legal? Does this follow procedure? The term of art in the community is tradecraft. And if you're staying within tradecraft, you're minimizing the danger or the risk to the operative as well as the people that are supporting that person. So Spy Games comes to mind. Bridge of Spies is an excellent discussion of the complexity involved in espionage and counterintelligence and the legal issues associated with it. Those are two that come to mind.
Okay, interesting. I mean, what's one of the things, I mean, we often say it, but I think it's quite true. It's not just a cliche that, you know, one of the things we learn a lot from is actually teaching to people. And the amount of things I've learned with teaching my students. I mean, what's something for you as you started teaching that was kind of stands out in your mind as something that quite interesting or unexpected that you learned?
Well, one of the things that we try to focus on is the civil liberties question in class. And while we have a number of foreign non-U.S. students in HPU, my experience is in the U.S. intelligence community, so I speak a lot to that. And the deeper you swim into that pool, the more you peel the onion back on the complexities of civil liberties in what we're seeing play out in the press today, is just a fascinating subject. What are the constitutional issues? What are the case law precedents involved? What is the balance between security and the protection of liberty? How do you create an environment where people are making important decisions associated with that multiple times a day, and help them understand where the gray area is when they enter that gray area? Who's authorized to be able to make calls associated with decisions in that gray area? So the more I delve into that, and it's a moving train as well, because the American people decide what is appropriate and what is not. And in some cases, the American people, through the Congress and the executive branch, decided what was appropriate immediately after 9/11. And the further we get away from 9/11, those assessments of what was appropriate are changing. And how do we modify our assessment of what is right and wrong as a representative democracy? And what do we do with the people who made decisions prior to that were in fact legal at the time and no longer thought to be appropriate? And how do we not create an environment where they're made to feel like criminals?
Interesting. On that controversial note, we'll have a short commercial break, and we'll talk about talking more with Brian Fila when we get back.
Aloha, everybody. My name is Mark Shklov. I'd like you to join me for my program, Law Across the Sea, on thinktechhawaii.com. Aloha.
You're watching Think Tech Hawaii, 25 talk shows by 25 dedicated hosts every week, helping us to explore and understand the issues and events in and affecting our state. Great content for Hawaii from Think Tech.
Aloha, my name is Jeff James, and I'd like to invite you to watch my show, The Military in Hawaii. It'll be shown every Friday at 11 a.m. here on thinktech.com. Aloha.
Aloha, I'm Kaui Lucas, host of Hawaii is My Mainland, here on Think Tech Hawaii every Friday at 3 p.m. We address issues of importance for those of us who live here on the most isolated landmass on the planet. Please come join me Fridays at 3 p.m. Mahalo.
Hello, welcome back to Global Connections. I'm Patrick Brack. I'm talking with one of our adjunct instructors at HBU, Brian Fila, who was a longtime professional in the intelligence community. So before the break, I mean, you kind of got at one of the hot button issues, talking about this balance between security and civil liberties. The previous week, I had a professor of philosophy on that I was talking with about his observations about have students shifted over time about where they find that sweet spot between security and civil liberties. I mean, have you found, again, one of the things that's interesting when you go back into the classroom is that often there's a generation or even maybe two generation of sort of shift or distance between yourself and the students. I mean, have you found that with the students that you're engaging with that there's a difference on the spectrum between civil liberties and security that is generational, or is this just temporal in terms of events, would you say? Like the farther we get from 9/11, then people are more concerned about civil liberties and security or something, or is there differences in generations, do you find?
Oh, that's a great question. Certainly the generational difference is about their historical experience. So for me, my parents, one of the definitive events in their life was the attack on Pearl Harbor. So that's where they immediately went to in their memories of what happened on 9/11. Many of our students were relatively young when 9/11 occurred. So they've grown up in this environment. And what I think is most interesting is the small percentage of students that are heavily influenced by the partisan debate that, the extreme partisan debate of the last 10 years, I think, in the United States, and want to go to the polls on a regular basis, the extremes. But most of the students are somewhere in the middle, interested in finding the truth, and I've actually seen that those that default to the extremes come into, yeah, this is a difficult subject. Yeah, the more I understand it, the more I look at the precedent. Some of these things are 3,000 years old as society.
Yeah.
And how do we, as an experiment in democracy, deal with those issues? How do you take extremely challenging issues of law and apply them in the United States in an environment where, in fact, outside the United States, no one cares about that law. No one has that same argument. What is the impact of choosing to operate in a certain way when none of your competitors, I would go so far as to say enemies, would choose the same way? And how do you not lose yourself in the process? Yeah. And it's wonderful to see the students wrestle with those issues. And what we try to do is we try to put a scenario out there where you run into Dr. Ash Carter in an elevator, and he asks you about the following issue. What do you say?
Yeah.
You know, I see that you're a HPU student, and you run into Hillary Clinton, and she asks you about the use of drones as elsewhere in the world for either as a covert action or a military action. what are the laws involved? What is the precedent? What is reciprocity involved? And I watch them wrestle with and get excited about being in the policy community of the United States and in other governments, again, because we have non-U.S. Citizens as our students, and as they wrestle with these issues. It's just fascinating to watch.
Interesting. One thing also that also fascinates me is that, and part of this might be the Hollywood or the pop culture influence too as well, but oftentimes I find when students start thinking about a lot of these issues, they tend to focus to some issues or some aspects of intelligence to the exclusion of others. So like a classic example is like on sort of collection methods, right? Because I think of our pop cultural background in a sense, human intelligence, espionage, counterintelligence, that tends to have a big primary place. Things like communication intelligence, signals intelligence, imagery, all this other stuff, it doesn't seem, a little bit too far removed, I guess, from the James Bond thing. Or the issue that you mentioned earlier, this issue, but, once you've got intelligence collected and you analyze it, how do you give it to the consumers of intelligence, the policymakers, right? And should there, is it truth to power? Is it cook the books so you get political favor? I mean, these different issues are often things that I find that the students they don't come to the class thinking about these issues. And then do you find that once you've raised these, that these get to be something that they really sink their teeth into, or?
Well, certainly, I hope so. What my experience has been is what's most effective is to bring their real world experiences into the pressures that the policy community are experiencing in their world. For instance, an overabundance of information.
Right.
How do you do that triage? You're doing that as a student. If you have something the size of a refrigerator on the planet and you're not hiding it, someone will be able to see it. You do that with Google Earth every day. You're to a point where with your smartphone you're using the GIS programs. How is that different than what the intelligence community is doing? When you're dealing with friends and they may be lying to you about an important issue, how do you discern whether they're lying to you? What's at stake? What are the balance? How can you ensure that? How can you double check behaviors? All of those kinds of things that we just take for granted manifest themselves in the policy community, and I think that's when it becomes live to them. I wrestle with that all the time. I'm not sure whether my close friend is lying to me about this or that. I wonder if that's like in Bridge of Spies, and whether we're wondering whether an intelligence asset is lying to you or not, or someone in your employ lying to you. Making it real for them rather than the abstract is I think one of the most powerful tools, and we do that in Poli-Sci 3650 at the undergraduate level, and then at 6650 at the graduate level, and then in STSS 6600, which is kind of a historical look back into intelligence operations in the 20th and the early 21st century. What are the examples that people have encountered? What were the pressures involved?
One thing I wanted to go back that you mentioned earlier was perhaps this use of these hypothetical or even sort of simulation sort of exercises. And one thing I found in my teaching is that it can be quite helpful, because oftentimes, often when you look at a historical case of something, and we often are drawn to cases where things go wrong, right? Or what could have somebody done better? And it's very easy to sort of Monday morning quarterback, well, I mean, obviously, in hindsight, so-and-so should have, blah, 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 blah. But often I find the simulation, provided you give people background about where people's priorities or blinders or other things that sort of constrain their decision-making ability, the way it happens in real life. I mean, obviously, we'd all love to drive a really expensive car that has good gas mileage and blah, 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 but trying to actually make that happen in real life is probably not going to happen, right, in a sense, right? There's going to be some balance. Well, I need extra space for the kids, and, well, I don't have enough money for the Maserati right now, and so on and so forth. Do you find that that's helpful for them to sort of give them, to make it more real in a sense?
Absolutely. The secret, though, is not to just role play, but to have them actually wrestle with the essence of the issues that are moral issues, that are issues of theory. How do you really believe the world works? What is the role of random act and chance in the process? What is the art form of taking a plan which never executes the way you would like it to, and being able to adapt to that situation? So rather than historical role play, what we try to do is really get into and we put names to them. You're the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You're Admiral Harris, and you're facing what's going on in the South China Sea. How does that relate? What can you be doing to understand that situation better? What are the risks involved? And that's when they really kind of sink in their teeth and enjoy it.
One thing that often is I've seen a lot, the federal government and the intelligence community, there's been this push to sort of, if you will, sort of diversification, inclusion in terms of the type of people who were recruited and brought in, and that having a diversity of people in, say, the State Department or the CIA or whatever the agency government gives you a sort of diversity of sort of worldviews and perspectives at looking at various issues and things. How have you found that in the classroom, that, you know, students, like you mentioned, we have a lot of international students, we've got traditional students, non-traditional, military, civilian. How do you find when they come together and look at it, the value of having different perspectives from different backgrounds?
Oh, I think it's amazing. I love those moments when an international student questions a fundamental assumption that a U.S. student hadn't really thought about before. What do you mean you don't think like the rest of us Americans on this issue? Why? What did you learn? And it's fascinating to watch that conversation, to have somebody sit at the table and say, that is not the history of World War II that I was taught. This is what I was taught. And watch really? Are there like entire countries that believe something different than what I've assumed to be the truth? Fascinating.
Interesting. All right, that's about all the time we have for today. As always, a quick show, particularly with a new format. But I'd like to thank you for coming and speaking with us, Brian.
Oh, it was great to be here. Thank you, Patrick.